Good morning, everyone. My name is David Gallo. I'm the director of the AIFC Academy of Law, and we would like to welcome everyone who has joined us this morning here in Central Asia for this exciting and valuable learning and development event. I'm especially thrilled and pleased today to introduce this event and our guest speaker. Dean Michael Hunter Schwartz is the 10th Dean of the University of Pacific's McGeorge School of Law. And I need to add that the McGeorge School of Law is my own alma mater. I'm extraordinarily proud of it. And I am excited beyond description to have Dean Schwartz do today's presentation. It's about 9 in the evening in California. And so Dean Schwartz, first of all, it's great to see you again. And we really appreciate the opportunity to have you join us today.
Well, thank you, David. And I really appreciate the honor of the AIFC asking me to speak. It's really a pleasure. It's great to see my alumnus, David, and to share ideas with my colleagues in Asia. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm going to launch right into my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
So you should all be seeing my slides. And that very odd picture you're seeing in the center of the screen is there for a reason. It's a reminder to tell you a story. And what we know about how human beings learn, about how the human mind works, is that in every culture in the world, we often communicate really important ideas through stories. And so I'm going to tell you a story, and I hope it captures something important that you will, I hope, get from my talk today. So this story occurs maybe 50 years ago in the United States, and a general in the US military was attending a military strategy conference. And it was in an enormous hotel. The hotel was so big that it was hosting 2 different conferences at the same time. And the general went to all the morning sessions of his conference, went off to lunch, and then he got back a little late. That sometimes happens with American conferences, that sometimes you spend so much time with your friends at the conference, you get back a little late. So he comes rushing into the room and rushes in, the people already talking, so he kind of sneaks in the back, sits down, catches his breath, and starts listening. And after only just a minute or two, he realizes that he's walked into the wrong conference. Instead of the military strategy conference, he's listening to oncologists, doctors who deal with cancer, talking about their frustrations in treating their patients. Because what they're talking about is that radiation seems to be a great way to kill cancer cells, but it was also killing the patient. And so they're really aggravated and frustrated because they see that it can really work to kill the cancer cells, but it was also killing all the healthy tissue and therefore killing the patients. And so the general's listening and listening, and then he can't help himself. He raises his hand and he says, I've been listening to you for a while, and we used to have that same problem in the military. In ancient history, this was a big thing. If we were attacking a fortress and we all came from one direction, it would make it so easy for the enemy to kill us because all they had to do was just shoot straight and they would get lots of us, and we might even shoot each other. And so over time, we learned to attack a fortress from all the way around, from lots of different directions. And what we found is that the enemy couldn't shoot all of us at once, and we weren't shooting each other, and we were able to successfully attack. And I'm wondering if that might work here. And so the picture that you're seeing is actually a picture of radiation being used to treat a knee, a cancer. And what you could see is that a small amount of radiation is coming from a whole bunch of different directions, and it's aggregating in the cancer cells. And so as you sort of think about today's presentation, I want you to think about this story because I think it tells us something really important about how we evolve as a profession in producing learning in any context, whether we're teaching classes or we're doing training, professional training programs, no matter what kind of training we're doing. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to do just a quick little introduction. You're hearing it now. I'm going to talk a little bit about my study I conducted of the most transformative law teachers in the United States. And this really applies regardless of modality. The people who have a transformative effect have a transformative effect regardless of whether they're in person or they're online. I'm going to talk a little bit about the myths about the excellence of in-person teaching. And then I'm going to talk about some particularly effective engagement strategies in online classes. And so that's where I'm going to be headed with my remarks today. So let me start with what really great teachers do. What I'd like you to do, because I think you're going to really see, and I've done this exercise with law professors from the Republic of Georgia, with law professors from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Taiwan, from Germany. And one of the striking things is how much my answers are similar regardless of culture. So I'd like you to think about this. I'll give you a moment to read what I put on the screen, and then I'll talk to you about it a little bit. So if you have that phenomenal teacher, that teacher that changed your life, if you have that person in mind, I want you to think about that person as I share with you the study that my co-authors and I conducted of the most transformative teachers in the United States, law teachers in the United States. So here's what we did. We started by soliciting nominations. And we received about 250 nominations from law professors all over the United States. And the people who were doing the nominations were students, alumni, fellow teachers, law school deans, presidents of universities across the board. And we asked each person who was nominated to submit evidence that they have a long-term transformative effect on their students, that these are the kinds of people who changed their students' lives. And what the people submitted was incredibly varying. But what we were looking for is 10 years later, they could say, this person is why I am where I am today as a lawyer. So a good example is a law professor at Boston College in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. I met judges all over, bankruptcy judges all over Boston who said, this person is so great at training bankruptcy lawyers that I won't hire anybody to work with me unless they've been trained by her. Another example, I studied a woman at Lewis and Clark Law School in Oregon. And I met somebody who said a project he did when he was still a law student in collaboration with his fellow law students was so transformative that project still gets passed around his law firm, the top law firm in the city of Portland, to this day. So these were people whose teaching stayed with their students for life. And I'll give you one more example. There's a professor at Florida State University, and his students told me it isn't just that the professor taught them more than any other professor they'd ever had in their entire lives, but about how to be a lawyer, but they also taught them how to live their life in a healthy, balanced way. Kind of an amazing thing. So we received all this evidence and we sifted it and we picked the 25 or 26 most effective teachers, the people who had the most convincing evidence to study in depth. And we went to their law schools. We did about 6 or 7 focus groups of students and alumni. We watched their teaching for a couple of days, and we interviewed them for about 3 hours each. And for all of those interviews, we recorded tapes and we had them transcribed. So we ended up with tens of thousands of pages of transcripts with all that interview data. And then what we did, my co-authors and I, is we identified what do those people have in common? What are the qualities? This is, in the United States, we refer to this as a qualitative method study. What are the things that these people have in common, regardless of where they teach in the United States, what subjects they teach in the United States? And those common qualities became the chapters, the sub-chapters, the topics that we discussed, and then we used evidence from those tapes to sort of support what we've done. And we published What the Best Law Teachers Do. It was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. So let me share with you what the common qualities are of these incredible teachers, because they're going to be really relevant to our discussion, because they apply whether you're in person or you are online. The first one is manifesting respect and humility. And for some of us, that's a pretty counterintuitive thing, because we think of our best teachers as sometimes being, let's say, very confident. But actually, the people who have a transformative effect on their students understand that teaching is a service profession. And when students feel like you are there to help them learn, they actually work harder. Literally, students would tell me, I would never want to be unprepared for my professor's class because my professor cares so much about my learning. I wouldn't want to disappoint him or her. The other thing they do is they manifest respect for their students. A really interesting answer in this example, and this might be a little disturbing because the United States has such a problem with guns, but one of the people that we studied was a professor who hates guns, teaches at a law school in Texas, Houston. And she had a student who loved to go hunting, and she remembered that about him. So 2 years after the class was over, she saw him walking around the law school, and she remembered his name, even though there had been 80 other students in the class, and said, hey, how are you doing? Have you had a chance to go hunting? So that was meeting the student where he was, even though she really didn't like what he did. The second one that's common among the people that we study is that they have high expectations. Whether you are online or in person, what we know is that if the teacher expects a lot of the student rises to the occasion. But it's important that you understand that high expectations actually have 2 different facets. One facet is that you demand challenging things of your students. You give them things that are hard to do because you want them to do those hard things to be successful. The second part, which is equally important, is that you communicate to your students that they can achieve those high expectations. And it's only when you have both that you have one of the qualities of these best law teachers. Third, a very common quality among the people that we study is that they are focused on continuous improvement. Let me give you a concrete example. In every course they teach, when the course is about half over, they ask their students, they give out their students an index card, or they send their students an email, and they say, write down 2 things that are working in the class and 2 things that need improvement. And they collect all that data, they study it, and then they report back to their students, and they say, here are the things I'm going to change to make this class even better for you. Kind of amazing, isn't it? Fourth, incredible creativity. Here's one that has kind of shocked lawyers and law professors all over the world. There's a professor at the University of Denver who teaches American labor law. And what he wanted to do is to give his students a concrete example of how labor law works in the United States. And so he allowed the students to form a labor union to negotiate the terms of his class with him. So he would be management and the students would be labor, and they could negotiate the terms of their working relationship with him. For example, how many different exam questions would be on the final exam? Would there be a midterm in addition to the final exam? How much would class participation count towards the grade? All of those things he would allow them to negotiate, but they would have to follow the law in forming the proper law and forming a labor union. And so one of the things that he did is that he would deliberately do things that violated the labor law, and they would have to catch him on it. And he worked out a relationship with the National Labor Relations Board in Denver, Colorado, where his law school is, so that they could challenge things that he did as violating the labor law. Fifth, the professors did enormous preparation. I'm going to give you my favorite example. A law professor in Illinois and a law professor in California both did the same thing. For every single case they teach, every single court opinion they teach to their students, they called the lawyers who handled the case, and they tried to get an inside scoop on what the strategies were, what the lawyers were thinking about, how the judges reacted to their arguments, how the jury reacted to their arguments. And so they prepared not only by studying the case, but also by studying the lawyers who handled the case. Another example, that woman at Boston College Law School in Boston, Massachusetts, she has been teaching bankruptcy law for 40 years. And to this day, if she is teaching at 1 p.m, she comes to the law school at 4 a.m. in the morning to start preparing for class. And then finally, a common characteristic, and I bet you've seen this in your best teachers, a passion for the subject and a passion for student learning. Somehow, the best teachers can make any subject exciting, and the worst ones can ruin any subject. And so if you have these 6 qualities, whether you are in person or you are online, you could have a transformative effect on your students. And if you want to sort of think of these all together, one way to think of it is that the relational part of teaching is as important as the expertise. It isn't that expertise isn't absolutely critical. In fact, the people we studied were wildly expert in their fields. But expertise without passion, without creativity, without respect and humility isn't enough. It's the combination of that incredible expertise with these other qualities that makes the difference for students. So let me turn a little and talk a little bit about some myths regarding in-person teaching. And the reason I want to talk about this is that whether I'm speaking to people who practice law or who teach in the United States or teach in any other country, I think sometimes what we remember are those teachers that kept us on the edge of our seats, that were so commanding of their subjects and so compelling in their storytelling that the class seemed to sing, and you realize the person had been talking to you for an hour and the time seemed to have just flown by. Those kinds of teachers that really, really make a difference. And as you think about those teachers, what I want to suggest is that may be a little bit more the exception than the rule. So let me start sharing with you some examples of the challenges of in-person teaching and why we shouldn't just assume that in-person teaching is inherently better than online teaching. So in the United States, the common method that we talk about is that calling on students and asking questions. And so when Mr. Gallo was a student at McGeorge School of Law, we would call on him and we would say, Mr. Gallo, in Smith v. Jones, tell us the facts. And then we'd ask him lots of hard questions. So that's kind of the American style of legal education. But here's the intriguing thing. That style with a class of 80 students, what we're assuming is all the students other than Mr. Gallo are answering those questions in their heads. So we asked US law professors all over the United States, so what percentage of your students do you believe answer those questions in their minds, right? Because they're not getting anything out of it. Only Mr. Gallo is benefiting if he's the only one answering the question that day. And what do you think the professor's most common estimate was? Do they think about 3/4 or almost all their students answer the questions in their minds? Maybe half, or almost 3/4 do, maybe only 1/4, or even less than 1/4. And let me tell you that as you're kind of guessing the answer, the overwhelming majority of US law professors estimate that about only 25% of their students actually play along their heads and answer the question. So this image we have in the United States of this fabulous teaching method, most of the students aren't getting the benefit of it. The second example is actually suggested by this cartoon. So I'm going to actually just let you read the cartoon because I think it captures something really important. I'll just be quiet for a moment. So I would suspect that every one of us on this Zoom has had the experience of someone who teaches by reading their PowerPoint slide to us. Or maybe you've gone through a professional development presentation where the speaker, all that he or she did was just read PowerPoint slides to you. And you thought to yourself what this guy thinks, that I could learn it if you just email it to me in advance, and then I don't have to spend the time listening to you drone on. In that context, there's really no benefit to an in-person teacher, whether it's a professional development session or whether it's a law school class. Here's a second category that sometimes some teachers use their time in the classroom to show themselves as being the smart one and the students as being less than. And as you recall from my remarks earlier, that actually doesn't work very well for many students at all. And I think almost all of us have had a teacher who, rather than engaging the students and assuming the students are capable of great things, their goal in teaching is to show how smart they are. Let me now switch though to what is being done all over the world for engagement strategies in online classes. So how you translate those 6 qualities that I talked about earlier to the context of online classes. And one of the things I actually forgot to tell David is I've just been appointed to the International Association of Law Schools accreditation committee to work on the standards that the accrediting body should use to evaluate online legal education. Because as we all struggle with this pandemic, and many of us are in lockdown. In the United States, we've been in, at least in California, I should say, we've been in lockdown since March, it means that all of our education has been entirely online. And so what I'd like to do is turn to how we translate those 6 qualities. And for a moment, I'm just going to quickly go back to those 6 qualities so that you can see them one more time. And then I'll go on. So remember, what you're looking for are ways to manifest respect and humility, to establish high expectations, to focus on continuous improvement, to be creative, to prepare, and to manifest so your students see your passion for the subject and for student learning. So that's what we're going to turn to. So let me talk to you about some of the things that you can do. So what I have here is a screenshot of a Zoom class, and I want to talk about 4 techniques that American law professors and law professors all over the world are using to increase their the engagement of the people in the room. So I was teaching a class this summer, for example, and maybe 6 times my co-teacher and I polled the students. So you can ask multiple choice questions and have the students on the spot respond to the questions. And here's the really interesting thing that the learning science would tell you that almost none of us would guess, which is actually the learning science would tell us that asking the students a question before they learn the material and asking them to record an answer actually produces better learning than asking them afterwards. I hope that's surprising to you. Why does that work? Why would that be a better way for producing deep learning? It's because when students have to think about a concept and come up with an idea, a response to a question, then when you start teaching it, they're looking for that answer. And so their mental work looking for that answer actually means that they're more engaged and they're more likely to learn. So polls can be a powerful tool for engaging students. And let me talk about just one other tool for polls that I've used in my online classes, and that is sometimes I ask a question where there isn't a clear right answer. And what I actually am looking for is for people to express a disagreement by their answers. Like I'm hoping about half the students will say the answer is A and half the students will say the answer is B. And my goal there is to get students to then have a great discussion why the answer might be A or why the answer might be B. And what happens, the way human learning works is that if I just ask the question and call on one of my students, the first student to respond might discourage other students from seeing that there was a different point of view. But by everyone seeing that about half the class held each of the 2 views, we increase the likelihood that people will feel comfortable sharing their views. Let me talk about a second engagement tool. Most of you by now have participated in a Zoom session where you broke out into breakout rooms. And here's a way in which online teaching actually can be superior to in-person teaching. According to all the educational research, the most powerful teaching tool in terms of deep learning, in terms of learning knowledge and learning skills, is small group work. But if you break students into small groups in person, they all distract each other because they're all talking at the same time. They have a hard time hearing each other. If the classroom's crowded, it's hard for the groups to get separation from each other. It adds a whole bunch of challenges. On Zoom, you can put people into breakout rooms and they can't hear each other at all. And the professor can visit each of those rooms and not be distracted by the other students in the class. And so you can take the single most powerful teaching tool known to humankind, small group work, and do it much more effectively in an online setting than in an in-person setting. Third, required chat comments. So a common practice in the United States is for a professor to pose a question and ask students to write their responses in the chat. And what that professor allows the professor to do is to immediately assess to what degree the students are getting the key concepts that the professor wants them to get. And that's a really powerful tool because in any kind of a classroom, professors say, well, to determine if my students are understanding, I look at their faces. But of course, a person could be frowning or could be looking uncomfortable, maybe because they don't understand, or maybe because they have indigestion from their breakfast this morning. And so reading people's faces has been proven to be a terrible tool for understanding whether students learn. But asking the students to express their learning in the chat, fabulous way to do that. And then finally, if you don't like breakout rooms, you don't like polls, you don't like required chat comments, the very least is you can ask your students to use the hand raising function on Zoom and say, well, how many of you pick A? How many of you pick B? How many of you pick C? So there's all these powerful tools in synchronous teaching. In the United States, we make a distinction between synchronous online teaching, like what we're doing now, and asynchronous, where the students can access the learning at any time of the day or night. All right, so I want to switch from sort of synchronous to asynchronous, that professors who sort of make learning videos. And I want to talk about 4 things that could make a learning video a much more powerful tool. So here's what we know. A video that lasts, I don't know, 40 minutes, there's no hope. What we know is that basically most humans start losing their focus after about 10 minutes. And unless you do something else to engage the people you're teaching, there's actually no hope that they're going to learn what you want them to learn, because they'll have lost their attention. So you have to do mini lectures, 10 minutes, maybe 12, maybe at the most 15. Second, let me talk a little bit about the format of a good active learning video. So what we know is that if you put a ton of details in your slides, that people will stop listening and they'll try to write down everything that you put into your slides. And as a result, they actually won't hear what you're saying. And so what we know is that you should have big concepts in your slides and explain the details, kind of like what I'm doing with you right now. The second is that we know that human beings learn when you have a mix of images and text. And so the more that your videos have a mix of both text and images, the more likely students are to learn. Third, note-taking guide. So this one's usually a new one for the people that I give talks to. So this is right from a study. They compared 3 groups of learners. One group of learner was given, all the students were given the teacher's teaching notes. Basically, the teacher said, here are my notes, here you go. One group of students were given nothing at all. And the third group of students were given sort of a very broad outline of the professor's lecture. So if you sort of think about this slide, this could be a very broad outline of what I'm talking about with respect to active learning videos. And they tested the students right after the lecture and then again 2 weeks later. Guess which students learned best? The students who were given the outline of the talk. They scored higher than both the students who were given the teacher's teaching notes and the students who were given nothing at all. And the students who were given the teacher's teaching notes and the students who were given nothing at all did about the same both on the immediate test and 2 weeks later, and the students who were given a note-taking guide performed much better. You're probably wondering why. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that when students get a note-taking guide, they look for what goes in the blanks. They look for all the things they should write down about length and about format and about note-taking guides and about follow-up quizzes. And so that mental effort, that active involvement, helps them remember the key concepts. The second thing is that a very good note-taking guide is organized with a hierarchy. There's the largest concepts, there's the next largest concepts, there's the sub-concepts under that. And so if a note-taking guide has that, it replicates how human beings store information in our brains, that we store information in our brains in organized structures. So let me give you a concrete example. I prepared these slides, about a month and a half, 2 months ago, after Mr. Gallo offered to have me give this talk. So where did I store those slides? I stored them in my folder on my university system under presentations. And then I stored them in a subfolder under 2020 presentations, and then in a subfolder for this organization. So that when I wanted to find the slides, I knew exactly where to find them. And that's because I remembered it because I had organized the larger category, the subcategory, and the subcategory. And then finally, what we know is that if you really want to make sure people have learned the key concepts, you actually give them even just a 5, maybe a 10 question multiple choice test on the key concepts. And what people have found is that really does lock in the knowledge. So let me turn to one last thing, and then I'll be able to save, it looks like about 15 minutes for your questions. So I'm going to talk about 4 things that have been shown to enhance community building in an online class. So the first one that is to have students introduce themselves. So let me tell you what this looks like in the United States in an in-person class from the best law teachers that we studied, and then what it looks like in an online class. In an in-person class, the best law teachers typically ask students to take an index card and introduce themselves to their professors. Why are they in law school? What do they hope to get out of the class? And what is one thing they want the professor to know about themselves? In an online class, this typically takes the form of the professor recording an introduction of himself or herself, and the students recording a short video introducing themselves. And then all those are posted or emailed to the professor or posted on a course webpage, a learning management system. Now, those self-introductions most create a connection between the professor and the student when the professor responds to those introductions. In other words, when the professor watches each one of those videos or reads each of those index cards and responds personally to the student. And so when my students did that in the online class that I taught last spring, I emailed each of them and made a comment on something that they told me about themselves. Like one of them said they wanted to practice entertainment law. In the United States, we're real big on our television and our movies, and this student wanted to be an entertainment lawyer. And so I told him about a case that I had done when I was a practicing attorney involving a lawsuit because someone stole an author's idea, my client's idea, and made it into a movie. And so I told him that I had done a little bit of entertainment law myself and told him that story and offered to talk to him more about his interest in entertainment law and introduce him to alumni of the school who are practicing entertainment law. A third thing that's been shown to build community is to build in opportunities for peer feedback. So if you're teaching an asynchronous class, that's one of those classes where the students can access the material at any time of the day or night, that effective teachers have found that it's helpful to ask students to post their responses to the professor's questions and then also respond to what a peer wrote in response to the professor's questions. And then they get graded both on their own response and on the quality of their peer feedback. And what that does is that it enhances the learning of both the student who receives the feedback and the student who provides the feedback. And then finally, partially through the magic of Zoom, but this could even be done asynchronously, one of the best ways to build community in a class is for students to break into small groups and to work on common projects for the class and then present them to the class. And what we know over and over again is that when students work in small groups, they learn more. And maybe it might be helpful for you to understand why they learn more. So if you imagine like today, there's about 25 of us in the room. And if I were to break you into groups of 3, that would mean that each of you would get more personal attention than I can give to each of the 24 of you here today, because you would be getting that personal attention from your peers. And so that personal attention is part of the magic of small group work. And this is something, if you ever want to sort of look at the research yourself, there are 2 researchers at the University of Minnesota. They both have the last name Johnson. So if you were to Google Johnson and Johnson cooperative learning, you can see that get access to their report on the thousands of studies that show that small group work has this profound transformative effect on student learning. So I guess I will sort of conclude by saying that, that what we know about online teaching is that it is still a field that is evolving. However, I think there's excellent evidence that there are phenomenal tools for engaging people, whether you're in person or you're online. And I hope I've shared some of those tools available to you. And most importantly, I hope that you remember that list of 6 qualities, I'll show it to you one last time, of transformative teachers. That they manifest respect for their students, and they are humble, that they establish high expectations, both in terms of giving students challenging work and in communicating that the learners can do it, that they focus on continuous improvement, that they are creative, that they prepare incredibly hard for class or for their presentations, and that they have a passion for their subjects and for the learning of everyone in attendance. So I will stop here. I will stop my share and entertain your questions. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your input and your questions.
Thank you, Michael. Almas, my colleague, is on the line. Almas, did some chat questions come in for Dean Schwartz?
Yes, thank you, Professor. So the first question is how ethical processes works when teaching online? Which is more valuable, education ethics or internet ethics?
So that's a great question. So there is a major problem, both in the United States and I suspect around the world, that without adequate technology, online teaching is really problematic. And in fact, that accrediting body and I are working really hard on that very issue, is how do we deal with the fact that you could have a brilliant student, but if that student is being booted off the internet because they don't have enough bandwidth, they're actually not able to learn. And so what I would say is that good teaching is good teaching, whether you're in person or you're online. But if you don't have the technology, you have a problem.
Okay, thank you. The next one. Why students fail to study online? Is it because of lack of control? How can we add the human touch and maintain student retention?
Oh, I love that question. Please tell the person who asked that question that I said thank you. So here was an interesting thing, and I'm going to answer by drawing on that study of the most extraordinary law teachers. I really do believe that the best teachers in all contexts think deeply about how they motivate their students. And so if you ask me, what is the most important part? The most important thing is finding a way to get the students to be excited. So I'm going to give you a really concrete example. The best teacher I ever saw in my life was a teacher we studied for that book. And here's what he said when his students, if one of his students wasn't prepared for class or wasn't engaging, he would, after class, privately email the student. And here's what he said. It was like magic. He would write the student, what can I do to better inspire you to engage in my class? And here's the magic of that little email. The students almost always wrote back, it's not you, it's me. I'll do better in your class next time, Professor, I'm sorry. It's that act of caring enough to check in on the student that inspires them to come back, re-engage, and take ownership of their role in the learning process. That personal touch, that reach out. And that starts with, if you sort of think about to my earlier remarks, it starts with that reach out right from the beginning of the course. So if the student sees that you are personally invested in that student right from the beginning, then when you reach out to them later, if they seem to become disengaged, they say, okay, this person really does care about me and I don't want to disappoint this professor, and so I'll come back. And it does really work that kind of a magic. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Professor. One more question, the last one. Dear Professor, what do you think are benefits of in-person learning?
That's a fabulous question. So let me make it clear by my comments about online learning. I don't even want to come close to suggesting that it's superior. I actually still, at least for me as a student, am a huge fan of the in-person experience. And part of that is that there's some magic that happens between students as they walk into class and as they walk out of class, for example. You know, if I do a good enough job inspiring my students, they will walk out talking about the concepts with each other, and they will continue to learn even as they're walking out of the classroom. Or if I've asked them to think about profound enough questions, they'll walk into class talking with each other about the questions. And so in the end, that sort of ability to connect. And the other thing about Zoom, especially if you have a very large class, like American law school classes are with 80 students, you really run into a problem. It's very hard to read each face. And I sort of think about, even today as I do these remarks, the only face I'm actually seeing at all is David's, and then one of you has a picture with your name on the screen. And so that's a loss when you can't look people in the eyes. And even if your reading of them is inaccurate, you still can, we know that there's all this communication that occurs through facial expressions and gestures with a hand and everything else. And those things are really powerful. And so while I've tried during my talk today to communicate my excitement about this subject, I'm actually incredibly passionate about teaching and learning. Nevertheless, I suspect I could have done so much more if I could have been seeing each of you, been in a room with you, and had an opportunity to see what, sort of see what you were nodding about and what you were curious about. And I might have been able to even more effectively encourage you to ask me questions now.
Thank you, Dean Schwartz. I think those were the questions that came in from the audience. I have a couple comments and questions. First of all, thank you for the absolutely fabulous and highly relevant presentation, especially around the pros and cons of online learning versus live classroom, and contrasting both with pre-recorded asynchronous, if you will, sessions. Just by way of reflection on some of the points that you made, it was really fascinating to hear your comments about how time-honored teaching methodologies in law, certainly in common law systems, is the Socratic method, as you mentioned, where the professor will ask a question, elicit responses, then we'll ask a follow-on question. But your comment about how valuable that was to the other 99 students who were listening to this was really a fascinating study that, well, maybe they weren't really learning so much by that exercise as what the premise had been among legal educators. Very interesting. And then also your comment about group breakouts. We all have been in blended learning situations, or where the format of a lecture might be broken up into some presentation by the professor, and then a breakout session, and then maybe someone in the group makes a presentation for each group, and so forth. We've all felt that, well, yeah, that's a really valuable methodology. But your comment about how online, that in many cases, you can accomplish maybe even more effective learning within each of those small groups because of what you mentioned. You don't have the distractions you would have in the live classroom. You don't have noise. You don't have people looking around at other groups. Whereas online, it's a much more methodical, orderly way to give each group member the opportunity to speak and for the others to listen. So I like the way you debunked a couple of longstanding myths with data. That really matters. I was especially interested in the the value of the so-called asynchronous pre-recorded lectures. I know for those of us who still need to get continuing legal education credit to keep their law license current, like I do in the state of Ohio, it's sort of a necessary part of the process. But as educators, here at the AIFC Academy of Law, we're attempting to prepare lawyers for international commercial law practice. So we're looking for the most effective way to do that, certainly to reach Eurasian audiences. The online format is fabulous. So a lot of our debate internally is, well, do we do it live synchronous, or do we do it pre-recorded asynchronous? In the latter case, it might be more convenient for learners, and it may be cost effective for educators to do the pre-recordings that they can use multiple times. However, for the learners, you made some interesting points about the 10 to 15 minute attention span for the live lectures. So these were my takeaways. And thankfully, you had provided an overview of some of your topics before this event. And so that was an effective teaching methodology, because I jotted down what I felt were the most important things from each of those topics. So there you go. But I am curious, when it comes to asynchronous learning, so 10 to 15 minutes, how would you recommend spending the remainder of that 1 hour lecture? You talked about format. So what do you do after the 10 to 15 minutes has expired?
It's a great question. And this one's actually pretty well studied. And this would actually even apply to an in-person lecture, so that you wouldn't want to in-person lecture for much longer than 10 or 15 minutes. And then what you would want to do is break it up with other teaching techniques. So you do a 10 or 15 minute lecture, and then the students do a multiple choice test to lock down the key points. And then you do an 8-minute lecture, and the students do breakout rooms to discuss a sort of a case study of the key of the application of the key points. And so there's actually a technique that's maybe the most exciting thing going on in higher education in the world, and it's called team-based learning. And every class in a team-based learning starts by the students taking a 10-question multiple choice test on their own. They turn it in to the professor, and then they take it again as a small group. And then the professor basically has the group say, for question 1, hold up your group's answer. Question 2, hold up your group's, etc. You can do this easily online or in person, but the lesson of it is that the professor can know if all the students got questions 1, 3, 7, and 9 correct, the professor doesn't need to spend any more time teaching that material. And if they didn't get questions, so you can really, it's almost like targeted farming. Like if you're doing farming really well, you should plant this crop here and that crop there. The same thing with teaching. If your students know 1, 3, 5, and 7 perfectly, then you only need to spend your time on 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's say you had a 1-hour pre-recorded lecture, asynchronous. Maybe 10 or 15 minutes would be a lecture. And then even if the learner is by himself or by herself watching this 1-hour presentation, are you saying that then there could be a quiz that has been pre-recorded and the student has time to do the quiz, and then maybe the answers come up and the student can see why A, B, and C were not right, but the D was? Is that what you're suggesting, that you could make
Absolutely.
the entire thing? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And if you are doing it entirely asynchronously, one possibility is that that you do the 10-minute lecture, then they take a quiz on it, then you ask the students to each post something to a course management system with their analysis of a problem, and then you ask them to work with a pre-assigned group of their peers on analysis of a more sophisticated problem. And so you have it chunked into those pieces until the end of the day, the end of the hour.
Okay, fair enough. Now I have a question as an audience member. And that is, you mentioned that you're now on a committee that is studying, the benefits of online learning and so forth. It seems that education was already on that path, at least to have blended learning and even, of course, some complete online degrees, LLMs and otherwise. My question is, what are your comments or your thoughts around regulators catching up? So it's one thing to have the smartest minds in the room, and I should have mentioned to the audience that Dean Schwartz was recognized 3 years in a row by the National Jurist magazine as among the top 15 legal education specialists in the world, I believe that was, in legal education. So that's fabulous. So we have the right guy here. So it's one thing to put a number of experts on a committee studying this and coming up with the data around it and recommendations around it. But what about regulators? So whether they are higher education regulators so that you get your accreditation, or governments who regulate lawyers and require certain credentials and assessments and so forth, including the degree that you have, and some regulators require degrees to be live face-to-face. What are your comments about the needs that might be required on the regulatory side?
Such a great question. I'm really grateful because I'm not often asked that question, so it's kind of a fun one for me to do. Thank you for that. So a couple of things. I do think that the regulators are trailing the capacity. In other words, we're able to do really great things in online teaching, and the regulators are a little behind, even in the United States, to be really clear. U.S. legal regulators are are a little behind as well. Like in the United States, you can't get a law degree that is accredited unless I think it's now 60, like 2/3 of your education is in person. So you can do 1/3 online. And so part of really what it's going to be necessary in the United States is what you alluded to at the end of your question, which is if the students perform as well on the assessments, the ones who have just 1/3 online in comparison to the students who have entirely in person, what I think will happen over time is that the regulators will start saying, wow, this really doesn't make sense that we're doing that. The second thing I would say is that that one really important thing that leaders in higher education across the world need to be doing is conducting the studies that justify regulators and governmental regulators and saying, wow, I can't really see a difference. Because I think, people, I want to figure out how I say this. As you can see, I have quite a bit of gray hair. And people who look like me have a tendency to say, if it isn't done the way I learned it, it can't be good. But so part of really what that is that we need to basically give them the data that they would need, the studies that they would need to be able to say, well, my hypothesis that it can't possibly be as good is wrong. And so we're going to have to prove it, I think, is really my answer, because that's how I think we'll change regulators' minds, whether we're talking governmental or bar associations.
Right. Thank you for that. I suppose as we are looking at the law school of the future and where we're headed with changes in the curriculum and format and requirements, I suppose it would make sense to engage regulators early on, if possible, by way of roundtable discussion so that dialogue becomes inclusive and so that the regulators are actually engaged in the process to some extent. Because you can come up with the greatest law school of the future, in the opinion of the experts who know, but if the regulators aren't in that loop, then you have a problem because students, graduates can't get their law license, so that could be problematical.
Absolutely, hugely so. And one thing I think where we will get, and I'm an optimist, David, so I will apologize for this in advance, but where we really should be getting to is that the things that can only be done in person, we do in person. But the things that we could do just as well, or maybe even better online, we should be doing online. And we should be using studies to justify when we're in the must be in person category and when we're in the, and there's a little bit of experimentation going on that in the United States, in that there's a number of programs where the students kind of go away and come back, where in certain educational programs, they might have 10 weeks of entirely online, and then they have 2-week intensives at the end of the semester. And so I think that might be a model that we may get to over time.
So I suppose you mentioned at least 3 major teaching methodologies: live and in person, the social atmosphere, the green campus of the McGeorge School of Law, and the ivy covered halls and study groups and coffee with your peers. There's no replacement for that to some extent. However, if you take that as one methodology, and then you have online synchronous interactive as another, and then for certain types of material, you have asynchronous pre-recorded, I suppose that it's that blend that comes up with the optimal approach in cost effectiveness as well as teaching and learning effectiveness. Would you agree with that?
I would agree 100%. And when I say they come back for 2 weeks, in some programs in the United States, even some online law school programs that they've started at Syracuse Law School has this, and Dayton Law School, where the students come by one weekend every month. and gather together to do some work. And so there's a lot of different kinds of models that might be possible. I think, you know, we're not there yet, but that's because we're all still learning. I'm counting on you to figure this out with what you guys are working on.
Stay tuned, because we'll need some top consulting advice, and I have your phone number. So Dean Schwartz, thank you so much. I did want to mention, first, I wanted to thank you on behalf of the AIFC Academy of Law and our various participants in this program from across Asia, Eurasia, for your time today. It's been absolutely fabulous. Dean Schwartz is an author of 10 books and 9 law review articles, and he has also written a contracts practice casebook. And so we're really pleased to have you here today. I wanted to mention one more thing about UOP McGeorge School of Law, not just because I'm an alum, but because I know this and I understand this, that it's a very progressive institution. And I know under your leadership, you've taken things even to the next level in terms of international recognition. And for our learners who are with us here today, I know that, that many non-US lawyers are looking to pick up additional professional qualifications in the US or in the UK or you know, other major jurisdictions and become dual qualified. I know in the states of New York and in California, the regulators are somewhat more liberal than in many of the other states because they do allow students who have a law degree that they did not earn in the US but elsewhere, or lawyers who are licensed to practice in non-US jurisdictions. There are opportunities in a couple of states to become US qualified. And I know that University of the Pacific in Sacramento, California, has programs, obviously the traditional common law degrees, JDs and LLMs, and then also LLMs that cover the common law subjects that a student would need to become prepared to take the California bar exam. So we look forward to potentially having some of our students really look into some of the programs at UOP, and hopefully we can continue this great cross-border education journey and create opportunities for global and international practitioners. So Dean Schwartz, thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to staying in touch. I hope you are well. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your attention.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.